Bullroarers and Stories. This essay was first published in the Journal for Living, number 21, in the year 2000. The very nature of young people insists that if they are to mature into useful, fulfilled adults, they must examine the outer edges of their culture and then return to community. Many young people go to college where their family or community beliefs are challenged at the edge of academia. Some chase to the edge of physical ability in the intense environs of high school, college, or professional athletics. Some challenge themselves with risk-taking in extreme individual sports such as bungee jumping, sheer-face rock climbing, or high-flying motocross. For others, the edge may be more personal, and sexual experimentation becomes the mode for testing boundaries. Maybe the drug culture or the internet domain becomes their personal trek site. For others, a trip into cultic thinking, curious spiritual habits, or spiritual isolation may define their edge. For some, it's the Marine Corps or the Peace Corps as a way to go beyond a familiar boundary. For certain young people, that edge is a criminal one. Young people are driven by universal forces. As they feel their individuality begin to sing its personal song, they spin to the outer edge of their community, like bull roarers creating loud noises. A bull roarer is a flat piece of wood at the end of a rawhide string that makes a roaring noise when whirled. It's used in some tribal people's ceremonies to call forth spiritual forms or energized entities, especially when there is some sort of lethargy in the individual or the community. The bull roarer is both a tool to call the spirit and an audible manifestation of the very spirit called. Young people serve the same rejuvenating purpose. Maybe through the sound system of a slick car or squealing tires, through loud parties or extravagant, shocking attire. Young people announce their presence to us and to the spirited realm. Through these forms, they are also celebrating their personal existence. More often than not, that's when they irritate the rest of us at the center. Elders, parents, neighbors, and younger children. Lest we forget, many of us older people, when gathered with our peers, reminisce on our own edge-playing days because those events were integral to our personal development. Although young people may pretend that they do not want to be part of their community, their loud songs are meant to remind us that they are still at our edge, courageous and useful. At a biological level, they are calling to others who may bring genetic vitality to the community, and they don't want us to abandon them. They want us to hold tightly to that bull roarer thong. It's their lifeline. As they mature, they want to be reassured that when the time comes, we will be strong enough to pull them back from the edge as they exhaustedly struggle to rejoin the center. How does one who uses crime as his risk-taking adventure return to the community? The athlete can return to his community and give back to his community merely by playing on his team. For those testing the educational limits, they may graduate and bring their knowledge back to jobs, community, or family. At the Minnesota Correctional Facility at Red Wing, where I teach, one of our stated goals is that when a juvenile leaves, he should have the ability to function in society as a productive citizen. To do this, we work diligently to provide the instructional methods best suited to the individual needs and the interests of the student and his learning style. Our job is to help the young man identify the skills he already has, to learn new skills, and then to help him identify the center of his personal community and his lifeline, his bull-roarer thong, which can guide him back from the edge. Some bull-roarer thongs are not strong enough, and the increased tension brought by the individual youth actually breaks the bond to his family. Many of our students have not had any familial, communal, or social center. We try to identify a meaningful life center for them, whether it is another family, his child if he's a parent, a neighborhood, or a workplace. To be a successful adult, he will have to be responsible to more than his own personal whims. Every student participates in an ongoing class on anger management, social behavior skills, and moral judgment. We try to lead the young men through the pitfalls of thinking errors, victimizing behaviors, and inadequate social skills. Our curriculum is based on the principles and practices of cognitive behavioral restructuring and cognitive social skill development. Through these classes, I have listened to young men describe the edge where they find themselves. Very little holds them to any center. No personal, family, or community ties. Often, only a fantasy or a hope is the connection. In some cases, the facility fence is the only thing keeping them from spinning further into the oblivion of criminal chaos. Our fence, a concrete symbol of the correction system, is the backstop catching young men who have slid past the social programs and communities meant to catch them. Like a wild pitch or a foul-tipped baseball, they gather, often neglected, along the backstop of the great American playing field. In Minnesota, our correctional philosophy for youth emphasizes therapeutic and educational programming. In most cases, when a young man is released from our facility, he has proven he is capable of responsible and productive behaviors. Yet, we cannot guarantee to what environment the young man will return. If no center exists for him, any chance of a useful life is greatly diminished. He must look to himself for inspiration and psychological sustenance. And hopefully, he will be able to deal with any isolation and the negative pressures he will surely face. This becomes a very difficult dilemma. He has no group to keep him accountable for his actions as he did in his Red Wing Cottage group, nor is he attending to another's accountability. Without parental or familial disciplines, his attitude about his dilemma is crucial. In most cases, inappropriate self-centeredness led him to our facility in the first place. Now, he must balance his self-centeredness with appropriate behaviors and find a connection to an actual community outside of himself. What do I, as a teacher, offer the young man with little or no helpful community? I once asked the poet Robert Bly, whose books Iron John and The Sibling Society address some of the cultural difficulties from which these men emerge. I asked Robert what he believed to be the best way to engage and teach young men in a correctional facility. He said they should first hear the story of how I, or any other man familiar to them, lived to be 50 years old. The youth will then know men who overcame obstacles and understand that there is hope that they too can live that long. Secondly, Bly said that folk tales and traditional stories should be part of any instruction. Folk tales instill a sense of hope with happily ever after and he lived to see another day. Stories give us access to a center, a collective human experience, which is a trustworthy anchor for individual experience. In this case, a story is a bull-roarer thong. I first heard Bly tell a folk tale to adult men, who later discussed how the story mirrored their own difficulties. I sat stunned as those men talked about the story as a personal map into adulthood. The psychological twists and turns of life, the difficulties and thresholds of life's danger, are played out through the vivid imagery and the flamboyant plots of folk tales. Years later, when I began telling folk tales to school children, I found that their observations were often as astute as those of the adults. Because there is an inherent story logic in all folk tales, a logic that has come down through millions of storytellers and listeners, the story becomes the expert text for life's survival skills. Often listeners will correct a storyteller who adapts imagery or plot alterations that overstep the bounds of that internal and communal logic. Something in the human psyche knows when the story is off the beam. The images, the plots, or the characters in fairy tales or folk tales have universal resonance. The third son who is a simpleton, the girl whose father is a widower, the brother who turns into a bird, the hag who cannot be tricked, or the ghosts who can. The human psyche, whether in childhood, adolescence, or adulthood, can absorb these story images easier than those present through the fine arts or mass-marketed icons. When an individual hears a story, the pictures he sees in his mind are as individualistic as he is. In this way, the lessons of a story can penetrate his intellectual defenses. Also, by telling a story, rather than reading it, the storyteller becomes a living and breathing part of the immediate creation. One mythologist said that the voice is half of the story's wisdom. I feel I'm finally getting old enough to properly tell stories. When I tell a story, I have little difficulty with listeners who do not pay attention. And if I can dim the lights in the room and set up an atmosphere of mystery, I almost always have perfect attention, even with the rowdiest of adolescents. Before I tell a story, I use a technique the storyteller and mythologist Michael Meade suggests. I ask each listener to pay attention to the story, so that if a detail, an image, or a plot change really strikes his imagination, he should carefully note it. That detail is then the individual's personal door to the story. And discussion about that door will indicate a personal issue the listener must address. That personal issue connects to an unacknowledged grief which has coagulated around the image. Once, I told a Grimm's tale, The White Snake, to a group at Red Wing. One young man said that he was astounded that the character in the story gave away his most precious possession, a fine horse that the king had given him. In a discussion that followed, the young man acknowledged that he had burglarized goods because of a self-centered fear that he would never have anything of his own. In the story, the character gained a princess and the king's throne and lands after giving away his horse and trusting his fate and his goodwill. A fear and grief about material things blocked the heart of this young man in Red Wing, who, upon release, received a job from the very man he burglarized. By acknowledging his fears and grief, he loosened the bonds that held him to criminal behavior. This sort of anecdote abounds when storytellers and listeners exchange information. In folk tales, the tricksters, the young hunters, magical beings, treasures, and beautiful princesses can captivate the imaginations of the most cynical young men. Once they see how a fairy tale can help them make choices and how different choices have different consequences, they become enthralled with the stories. The stories about bags of gold may appeal to the more materialistic young man, yet with a little explanation, with a little shift of consciousness, that same young man might see a bag of gold as a symbol for his freedom. Then his attention is snared. Traditional stories are, according to the storyteller and writer Joseph Bruchac, they're cautionary tales and guides to behavior. Because of their criminal behaviors, the youth at Red Wing need guidance and cautionary lessons that can penetrate their usually defiant and hardened habits. They need to be convinced to choose appropriate behaviors. In our work, we teach that internal choosing precedes behavior. Impulsive youngsters have not often thought about this concept. Often these young men see themselves as more clever than the average youth, and fairy tales often emphasize how cleverness can pay off. In folk tales, the cleverest one has to think ahead, make plans, be able to think on his feet, and understand the consequences of his choices. These are the skills that are reinforced by our program. We help guide their thoughts about themselves to help them toward appropriateness. They might also learn that, as in fairy tales, sometimes too much cleverness can backfire. However, sometimes foolish courage is needed. How many youth display this quality? In the Russian fairy tale, the Firebird and Princess Vasilisa, when a young hunter is told, if you pick up the Firebird's feather, you will know trouble. The young man picks up the feather anyway. He then has to pass a series of trials. Throughout the story, his horse advises him. Eventually, he wins Princess Vasilisa's love because he trusted his horse and heeded his advice. Maybe the horse represents the basic instincts of the youth. Maybe the horse represents the words of a dead grandfather. Maybe the horse symbolizes horse sense. The horse sense a man, especially a young man, inherently has. In our program, almost every lesson is structured to remind the young man to stop and think, plan ahead, and listen openly. So many respond and say, this is just common sense. When a storyteller can equate horse sense with common sense, the story suddenly carries more weight, and its lessons slip into the imagination of the defiant mind of a youthful offender. The choices of the young men in Red Wing are similar to those choices of many fairy tale heroes. Time and again, they've been told by parents, police, probation officers, court officials, and educators that if they choose certain behaviors, they will know trouble and incarceration. Like fairy tale heroes, they may not have listened to the advice of their elders or to their horse sense. Yet, in story after story, despite the ordeals, despite the quandaries and desperate situations, there is always hope. Cleverness is rewarded if the hero's heart is good. The simpleton triumphs if his heart is good. Strange animals help the prince if his heart is good. Most young men believe their own hearts are good. We must encourage them to continue to value the goodness they feel. We must honor that inner knowledge at every opportunity and acknowledge the shining heart behind the hard facade. If his heart feels good, the light of hope penetrates a young man's darkest fears. A young man, thus supported, sees commonality in his personal experiences and becomes connected to the rich sweetness of the wider human experience. Now connected to other men who have lived that same type of story, he can add his story to the stories of his family or community, and suddenly he knows in his deepest mind that he is both unique and connected, useful and involved in the universal process of growing up.